The people, the headlines, the issues impacting you and your family. This Week in Cincinnati on WCPO 9.
Welcome to This Week in Cincinnati. I'm Evan Millward. This year, WCPO 9 News has taken a close look at the issue of gentrification in our community. At the center of that effort has been reporter Monique John. Monique comes to us as part of the Report for America program. In fact, we're one of only a handful of TV stations in the country that's part of that. Her reporting background includes working with the BBC and the Voice of America. Today, we're going to take a look at several of Monique's reports and talk with her about the impact they have already had. We start in Over the Rhine and Findlay Playground. It reopened this year after being closed for nearly 2 years, but that reopening had led to some unintended consequences for some neighbors. Monique John shows us in July why some people were unhappy and what they hoped would change.
Residents in this gated community of affordable housing on Green and Republic Streets used to enjoy quiet, peaceful days like this one. But now, some people who live here say the music and lewd activity that has migrated onto their street is driving them up the wall. Just last week, a nearby shooting left a bullet hole in the window of a ground-level common area belonging to Cornerstone Renters Equity, an affordable housing community located on Green Street.
It has taken a toll. It's definitely something that you have to constantly remind yourself that what goes on outside is not what's going on inside.
Right here at Republic and Green Streets is the nexus of where there is so much undesirable, often illicit activity. Drug deals, loitering, loud music, gambling. And the kicker is, many of these people on the street don't actually live in this neighborhood. That's because many of those who congregate here haven't been able to go to their preferred hangout spot since it closed nearly 2 years ago. City officials announced last week they were reopening Findlay Playground this weekend. Residents by Green and Republic are glad the park is reopening, but many are annoyed that they were fenced off from the park for so long.
When we talk about crime and drug dealing, that's in every neighborhood. That's no reason to keep a fence up around a playground. Nowhere in this city in the county has they put a fence around the playground except for in Over the Rhine to appease the white people, the gentrifiers that moved into this community.
But others, especially those who live closer to the park, have felt the park should remain closed until there are bigger, more definitive reforms. They're focused on the violence, drugs, and illicit activity that caused the playground closure in the first place.
We need this park back, but we need this park back without drug dealers. We need the park back without open container prostitution. How to achieve that? Well, that's what we need to work towards.
It remains to be seen whether the reopening of Findlay Playground will drive voters away from Green and Republic. Until then, residents say they are walking on eggshells, doing what they can to dodge trouble and safely make it inside their homes. Over the Rhine, Monique John, WCPO 9 News.
So Monique is here to talk about this. Monique, I'm interested, did it drive any of that crime elsewhere? What has changed in these last few months?
Unfortunately, not much. The residents and the administrators over at Cornerstone are explaining that drug activity, loitering, people playing loud music, people even doing bizarre activities like cutting hair and like opening up barbershops on the side of the street, really disruptive behavior is still happening in that area, even though Findlay Playground has been reopened, and it was reopened shortly after that report, after we began reporting on the issue earlier this summer. So it's still a big frustration. I will say that groups in the area like Cornerstone, like Element, other smaller agencies, they have been rather engaged ever since the park reopened to help provide programming within the park, as they were encouraged to by the CRC. There was a plan that was put forward for there to be small grants issued to support that kind of programming, and they were kind of engaging in pilot efforts to get that ball rolling and ultimately be able to petition for that grant money to support those efforts. But one of the administrators over at Cornerstone, Elisa Berry, explained to me that to their frustration, that plan was pulled. There's a city official that ultimately kind of canned the project and had just opted not to issue the grant in the end. We do know that there was a motion put forward in order to use TIF funds, city funds, that would help beautify and continue to expand and develop the park even further. So there has been an RFP issued for developers to help with that effort. So we know that that's something that is being actively worked on into the new year. But it remains to be seen exactly what the participation will look like with the smaller agencies that have been actually more involved since the beginning.
Monique, the sense I get from you then is that this is just still a wait and see issue as to what may change at Finley Playground and if anything were to change for the neighbors in that area.
Absolutely.
All right, Monique,
and
John.
They're still set.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we're going to continue our conversation with Monique next as people are fighting to keep their home. We're going to follow up on what happened to a Walnut Hills apartment building home to many seniors and people with disabilities. That's next on This Week in Cincinnati. Inside this historic building in Walnut Hills, a group of senior citizens were on the verge of losing their homes in August. The Alexandra Apartments has served as a neighborhood landmark for more than 100 years. 16 years ago, it was upgraded and built as low-income housing for senior citizens. Reporter Monique John looked into what happened and the new fight residents were preparing for.
Driving along Gilbert Avenue or Taft Street in Walnut Hills, it is almost impossible to miss the formidable, majestic Alexandra Apartments complex.
It was one of the most convenient buildings that I could live in. We have a lot of things around, and it's good for me because of my disabilities.
George Smith, like a number of his fellow tenants at the Alexandra, have been living in the building for many years. The building was renovated and reopened as a low-income senior living facility back in 2004. But now, the building is up for sale, meaning its vulnerable residents could be forced to leave.
It's frustrating because I don't know if I got to get ready to move or not.
The shakeup came when the owner of the property, which is controlled by the Miller Valentine Group, failed to refinance the building last December. The note on the building was then sold to an out-of-state lender called Fairview Loans, who then decided to foreclose, prompting the Alexandra to be put up for sale. Residents currently have another 3 years to live in the building, but they are waging a legal battle so that the new owner would be required to honor the full 30-year commitment that is in the Alexandra's contract as a senior living facility. That would mean residents would get to stay for another 13 years, not just 3. In court, residents argue the building must be kept affordable because of its tax credits from the Internal Revenue Code. Tenants also say that the building is fully occupied and that they have been paying their rent, so there was no reason for the owner not to refinance.
The low-income use restriction is good for 30 years. Tenants have a right to enforce it, and the only way that the ownership can get out of it is if there's a legitimate foreclosure, and we intend to show that the foreclosure is not legitimate.
Smith says he's optimistic because the judge is on their side and the tenants have strong support in the community. Still, he and his fellow residents are worried. Many of them don't know where else to go. It's also uncertain when the court will make its decision about whether residents can stay for the Alexandra's full affordable housing time commitment.
We need to fight for people that are low income. We need more buildings in this community for low-income people because they are people too. And with this crisis going on, we don't need people that's sitting out here on the street getting sick.
Walnut Hills, Monique John, WCPO 9 News.
So we bring Monique back now with us. Monique, obviously this has been in court. Courts have slowed down. Has there been an update on this proceeding?
The courts are still working on this. So this one, the most significant update here is that the model group has been working with the Walnut Hills Redevelopment Foundation in order to help preserve the building. Their goal is to have Walnut, the RF, essentially take over as an interim owner and then kind of redevelop that plan into a more long-term plan for the model group to help preserve the space as an affordable housing space for the elderly and for disabled people.
And that's one thing that jumped out to me, is that even if it is saved now, they're still kicking this can, 13, 14 years down the road, when this will come up again. And there's so much interest in Walnut Hills that this could be a conversation we're having again in a little more than a decade.
It could very well be. It could very well be. And it really remains to be seen what Walnut Hills itself overall will look like in that time. I think something interesting I personally found as I was getting to know people in the area is that it seems as though people have a slightly different approach or attitude towards how they can manifest gentrification in their own neighborhood in a way that is more inclusive. So hopefully that will come about and we won't have similar issues with marginalized, vulnerable people like these residents here being, at risk of being pushed out of their homes. But this will likely be another issue that comes back up again and again in the future.
And that's one thing that jumped out to me too, listening to your report, is that this is sort of the exact thing we talk about when we talk about issues around gentrification, is folks who have been in a home, in a neighborhood for more than a decade, sometimes more than a generation, being forced out because of change. Were you hearing that concern elsewhere in Walnut Hills too?
Well, I can't say much on that because the Alexandria is where I have largely focused my attention. But I will say that another report that I had done previous to this was at another development that previously was low-income affordable housing, and sure enough, that got redeveloped into condos. Sure enough, they were, more moderately priced condos, but they were condos. So I do think there is the, continual risk of people who are still low income, still marginalized, being at risk of being pushed out. But perhaps that may be to a different degree than, say, over the Rhine.
Yeah, a lot of eyes on Walnut Hills and over the Rhine, and one other Cincinnati neighborhood in particular. When we come back, Monique joins us again with plans to renovate an old Cincinnati school that is teaching us a lot about development. We'll see her report on that and find out where things stand with this school when we return to This Week in Cincinnati. We took a close look in October at plans to transform this historic abandoned school building in the West End into lofts. That process has turned into quite a journey. The original developer had plans for luxury housing and additional development. Then another developer took over the project with a more conscientious approach. Monique John picks up the story from there.
The Heberly School was acquired about 2 years ago by Golan Marome, the head of Zada Development.
It hasn't been in use for quite some time. So we just really want to breathe some life into the community.
Heberly, built in 1929, was by then a condemned building and sold alongside a number of other Cincinnati public schools in auctions dating back to 2009. Marome, a New Yorker, is now the sole owner of the building and has a new, modest vision to turn it into lofts for young artists.
Right now, what I think that the community is lacking is not necessarily affordable housing, but maybe something, a step above that, so housing that's unassisted, but that's at a price point that people that are starting their lives, can feel comfortable in.
He declined to give figures as to how much the project might cost or the estimated rates of the lofts, saying that's still to be determined. It's also still uncertain when development will start, and Marome says he'll have to reapply for the tax credit he previously received from the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program. That's because he's departing from an earlier vision from another, now defunct entity to turn the building into luxury housing. But he says he'll maintain the building's architecture and convert classrooms into units. The reinvention of the historical building feels like a nod to the cyclical gentrification that has come to shape the West End's legacy. Affluent white families moved to the hillsides for nicer homes through new transportation options in the early 1900s, making way for thousands of Southern black migrants to settle in the area. But urban renewal projects like the 1950s construction of the I-75 and the current work on the FC Cincinnati Stadium have become notorious for pushing out the West End's vibrant community and vulnerable black families generations later.
Most communities want investment They want their community to be improved. They want to see change and betterment, but they don't want to be displaced.
Robert Killens, the West End Community Council president, says it will be crucial for the community to have a plan that will allow longtime residents to live comfortably alongside ones who are just moving in. He acknowledges that new amenities can not only mean displacement and higher rent costs, but also increasing property taxes that could put pressure on some homeowners. Like Killens, author and expert in Black Cincinnati history Gina Ruffin-Moore says good things come with gentrification, but is leery of what major neighborhood enhancements like that of the Hepperly School could mean for the area's future.
The truth of the matter is that the West End won't be the West End 20 years from now. We have to preserve the history and the hard work of the people who established the West End. The West End won't even look like the West End anymore.
New improvement plans making their way into a small, proud, yet in some areas blighted and vulnerable community. West End. Monique John, WCPO 9 News.
And Monique is joining us again to talk about this. Monique, it sounds to me like he's in essence starting over when it comes to sort of the red tape of this development. Is there a timeline on his new plan?
I'm not aware of one, and that's actually something that I think draws some concern and frankly a bit suspicion, because it's when I was working on this story at first, there was a lot of mystery surrounding that initial entity that was working on this project, but also another school just down the block. So it's really remains to be seen how much longer it's going to take for Zada Development to have more significant activity on this, especially because it's something that's been in the works for a while, and even in Mr. Marome of Zada Development starting over, it's been some time since he started this process.
This is
yeah,
Monique, kind of a key piece of real estate in the West End there. You mentioned the suspicion here. Have people almost given up hope to see this project come through in the immediate future or the near future?
I mean, I think people are just frankly very unaware of what's really going on with it. I think that there are certain people within the Dayton Street Historical Society, people right there on Dayton Street, who have been directly in touch with Zada Development about the project. I understand that there are some churches that Zada Development has also been in touch with about it too, there, who use part of the space, but I think people are a little kind of questioning what Hepperly Lofts really is going to be, how long that's going to take. You know, there's a lot of question marks around there. And frankly, as a last point, you know, I reached out to Mr. Marome of Zada Development for any updates, and he did not respond.
All right, playing wait and see, and we know you'll stay on it, Monique. Thank you. This week in Cincinnati, we'll be right back. Reporter Monique John, you've been with us a full year here. Working on this gentrification reporting. What are some final thoughts for us before we go, and what comes next?
Well, it hasn't been a full year. It's been like 6 to 7 months, and I'm anxiously kind of waiting to see how the rest of the first year goes. But I'm really looking forward to actually doing more reporting on the impact of FC Cincinnati, and really delving further into the relationships that I've had the privilege of to build so far here in order to keep enriching my reporting.
Excellent, Monique John. Not quite a full year, but you've made it a full almost year here in Cincinnati. We appreciate you as part of our team and look forward to the work you're doing in the future. That is our time for This Week in Cincinnati this week. Join us for breaking news, weather, and sports tonight at 6 and 11 right here on WCPO 9 News. And of course, keep WCPO.com bookmarked and keep that WCPO 9 app handy for all the latest headlines. We'll see you soon.